Hi there. I was going through my notes, my emails about this presentation and what I was supposed to do, and of course I realized I had too many PowerPoint slides, and then I saw this bit about I was supposed to have my crystal ball and look into my crystal ball. And some of you may not remember, I was here 2 years ago. I'm kind of surprised I'm back. That was just before the opening of the Hyatt Place, the Courtyard, the Press Hotel, and the Westin had just reopened, the Westin Eastland. Had just reopened, and I had said something about, I was concerned about oversupply. I was trying to be delicate, but we were looking at a dramatic increase in room supply. And so I had said that I was concerned about that, and talked about what some of the potential implications of that would be, and none of those things happened, which is good news for all of you. And I think some of you heard Vin commenting on his presentation about how the Courtyard had performed better than he expected. So I'm glad to know I was not alone in being surprised. But I have upgraded my crystal ball. I am no longer using Siri. Siri and I are on the outs. She's no longer my crystal ball, but I have got a new one. I'm going old school here, a little retroactive. I'm going back to the Magic 8 Ball. So I'll be breaking this out later as I get further into the presentation when I really need it. Let me get right into things. First, I want to give you a U.S. perspective, talk about what's going on in the U.S. industry, and it's very interesting hearing what's been said here in Maine relative to kind of the national hotel investment conversation that's going on. And first, let's just start by looking at the U.S. occupancy here. You can see the big thing here is I want to go back to 2000. That was just before the 2001 recession. You can see we dropped down for a few years, came back, bumped along, and then we got hit with the 08 to 2010 recession. Since then, we've had 7 solid years of occupancy growth. 7 years is a long time, particularly for a lot of us in this room, who've been watching the cycles. This is probably our 3rd, 4th cycle. Average daily rate, similar situation. We saw a steady increase, we saw a drop with the recession, and now it's 6 years of steady growth in average daily rate. And my sense is that we're all waiting for something bad to happen on the hotel side. Frankly, there's a lot of talk in the hotels. You go to the hotel industry conferences and they all say, what inning are we in? And I was on a panel last night, and there were 4 of us, and from a hotel perspective, we were all, feeling like it was the 8th inning. One of us was in the 9th inning. But there's no, as the earlier economist was saying, there's no real evidence to really back that up. A lot of the indicators are actually positive. It's more a matter of fatigue, and I'm afraid we're going to fall into this psychological thing where people start backing off. One of the lodging REITs came out and announced that they'd had 6 consecutive quarters of decelerating RevPAR growth. RevPAR is revenues per available room. They're still getting RevPAR growth. It's still growing and everything's fine, but they've had this deceleration. And that's sort of what we're hearing too, is there's been a lot of talk about how great last year was and the challenge in getting more next year. And while we're on the national, it's not helped by the fact that the New York lodging market's going to have a rough first quarter. Chicago's going to have a rough first quarter, and Boston is also going to have a rough first quarter. Not bad, but just not as great as it's been. And so that gets into the psyche, which worries me a little bit from a hotel investment perspective. Anyway, this is the combination of occupancy and rate. It's RevPAR, revenue per available room, as I mentioned. And you can see here we are at, again, we've got 7 consecutive years of growth, very strong growth recently. So things are good. And again, there's no reason things shouldn't stay good. And in fact, the national prognosticators, there's 3 in the hotel industry that issue national projections. The 3 biggest anyway are Smith Travel Research, STR, PKF, and PwC. And you can see STR and PKF are projecting growth in occupancy for 2016, really solid growth in average daily rate, over 5%. All of them are over 5, with PKF over 6. For RevPAR growth, the lowest is 5.7 for PwC. One thing to note is that these projections are all from last fall. They don't update them, as regularly as one would like, but frankly, if they updated them regularly, you start to wonder about the accuracy of it anyway. But there does seem to be a little bit more pessimism and a little bit more cautiousness in the air from a national lodging perspective right now versus even a month ago. Oops, sorry, wrong button. I want to talk briefly about Airbnb. It's a really big issue in our industry, and it's interesting, just listening to the last presentation about the government affairs, and our industry, the lodging industry, is really behind the ball on this in terms of lobbying. Airbnb has really gotten out in front of this. Probably, and they've done a better job than, for example, Uber, which is obviously another example of the sharing economy and the implications. What's interesting about Airbnb, and the reason I wanted to put this slide in, is one of the big things is that this growth is just exponential. You can see it going from around 70 to 80,000 over 200,000 available units for 159% year-over-year growth. The BAML says that Airbnb is about 2 to 4% of total U.S. hotel room supply. I think that's a little bit aggressive. I've been asked to review some of the numbers, some of the Airbnb numbers for Boston, for example, and it's not quite that strong on a national level, and it's more in pockets. But what's interesting and important to remember about Airbnb is nobody really sees it. It's not like suddenly a 300-room hotel opened down the street and your hotel is getting clobbered because everyone's going there. These rooms are spread out. If you go on Airbnb today, there are 300 units available in Rockport area. If you Google Camden Airbnb, there's 300 plus units available. Now, then it gets muddy again because it's like, well, when are they available? They're not available every day the way a hotel room would be available. They're available whenever the owner wants to put the unit on the market. But I was also surprised to see, I don't know if there's anyone here from Ocean, but there's a condo at Samoset that's listed on Airbnb. So you're really seeing this interrelationship, and it's going to get stickier. And there are towns in Maine that have looked at legislation. The big issues with Airbnb are taxes and life safety are two of the biggest issues. And so the industry really needs to be paying attention to it and seems to be paying more attention to it, particularly in New York now as we see the New York market start to drop, and it's one of the strongest Airbnb markets. As we see occupancy kind of start to soften in New York, that's due to a combination of Airbnb but also new supply. It's easier to point to the new supply than the Airbnb because also Airbnb keeps their data relatively confidential. They don't really want you to see just what the impact is to the market, to the lodging market. So anyway, something to keep an eye on and something that we're going to be talking about more and more in future years as we look forward, particularly here in vacation land. Right, because Airbnb targets the leisure traveler. They're starting to get into the corporate world a little bit, but really their target is the leisure traveler. Speaking of leisure, I want to touch base on a few trends. I'm going to try and focus on trends rather than forecasts, given my track record. Bleisure. I think I'd also heard it called Weisure. I don't know. You're going to see it on every slide. I'm going to talk about leisure, corporate, and group, and bleisure is the thing now, and it's really being driven by millennials, and it's a shift. It's driven by millennials, and it's driven by this, and it's driven by the laptop and the iPad that you have in your hand right now, because you take your work with you, and you're blending your work and your leisure. And so it's important for hotel operators to remember that and be cognizant of that as they're going out and they're marketing to their visitors. A note on baby boomers, they plan to travel a lot they've got a lot of disposable income, they've got a lot of time on their hands, and they're not afraid to use it. So they will be traveling, and that is good news for Maine because they're leisure travelers. They also are surprisingly not rate sensitive, at least according to the survey data. Experiential travel is a really big deal these days in leisure industry, leisure travel, and that really helps Maine, obviously, right? You know, you come to Maine and there's so much to experience, you know, so much culture and such a sense of place really throughout Maine. So again, that's a real positive for Maine, as is the National Park's 100th anniversary in August. A note, TravelClick. I wanted to try and get some statistical data on the outlook, and TravelClick has that transient leisure demand up 4.6% and average daily rate up 2.8% for 2016. So pretty good, but if you note, that's around what the prognosticators are saying overall for the industry in terms of growth. Group travel, again, they're talking about bleisure. When you go look at the industry publications, planners are looking to incorporate leisure activities into meetings. One of the signs that we've recovered, we can stop talking about the recovery. You know, as you know, I feel like I'm Dr. Doom and Gloom here, you know, where things are on the downside. We're definitely, if we're not on the downside, we're sure near the top, because when meeting planners are talking about incorporating leisure into their leisure activities, into their meetings and events, it means that they've got the money to spend. Right? There's no longer that psychological thing, we got to really contract and focus on getting things done. We need to provide this holistic experience for our attendees. Also, attendees are adding more and more vacation time before and after meetings, and also similarly before and after business trips. Again, good for us, right? Boston is very hot right now. In fact, it would be good for us. The more hotels they build in Boston, the better, because people fly into Boston and then they come up here. Flexible meeting space is more important than ever. That's kind of a relation to the millennial effect and the whole .com. Now, meeting planners are not happy with a classroom setup. You need to have, you know, the ping pong tables and the beanbag chairs and all of that. And so, anyway, that's a trend that we're seeing more and more now, just more flexible space and a little bit less structured, if you will. TravelClick saying demand's up 2.5% and rates up 4% from a group perspective. Business, again, bleisure. Global Business Travel Association says new hotel prices are going to rise 4.7% in 2016. That's pretty much right in there with what most people are expecting. The Starwood Marriott merger I could talk about for hours. The sense is it is going to lead to higher prices. It also is going to create some interesting antitrust implications. Starwood and Marriott control about 90% of the group hotel rooms that are suitable for groups in Boston, in markets like Boston, Philadelphia, Seattle, New York. So it's going to be interesting how that plays out, but it looks as though it's going to go through, and it's going to take a while to sort out. Rewards programs are becoming less generous for business travelers. That's good news for independent hotels because it makes them more competitive, as does the transparency that's offered by the internet. You can go on the internet now and learn everything about a hotel, so it's a safer bet rather than it used to be when you just didn't know anything about the hotel. Fees are going up from the brands. They're going to start charging more, particularly with the consolidation of Starwood and Marriott. TravelClick says that this is very interesting. Transient bookings are down 3.2%. And this is something that I've heard too from operators in Boston in particular. But I spoke with a friend who's got some hotels in Washington, and he too has seen a softening. Over the last 3 months, there's been a softening, and things aren't quite as frothy as they were. They're not bad, but they're softening. You know, they're not crazy. It's not crazy good. It's just a little bit softer, and that is that coupled with the market going haywire, as I said, is making people nervous. Looking at Maine. So Maine's interesting. This graph is particularly interesting. This shows you the occupancy from 2005 to 2015. And 2007 was really an anomaly up there at 62.4%. And I'm reminded of, there's that old saying, Benjamin Disraeli, I think, said there's 3 types of lies, damn lies, and statistics. I think this is one of those instances where I'm a little skeptical. These numbers come from Smith Travel Research. The hotels send their data into Smith Travel. Smith Travel puts it into the aggregate and then spits out the reports. But they don't have great participation in Maine. And so I wonder if that 2007 is a bit of an anomaly. Particularly when you see how consistent it's been at 2010 through 2015, bumping around in the mid to high 50s, which is about what you would expect. Maine is a seasonal occupancy market. It's a seasonal market. You know, it's very difficult to get people to go to Camden in, you know, January or February unless they've got a good reason to go there. I mean, granted, there's the Snow Bowl, but, you know, in general, we're largely capped, right? So the idea is that we're sort of at capacity in the high 50s. And in general, when we're asked on a national basis about the New England market, we'll say, you know, you might get up into the high 60s or into the low 60s at some places in southern New England and the Cape, or in some places in Vermont where you've got four season, you know, where you've got a strong winter and summer. But in general, New England's a 60% market, and when you're as far north as we are, we're a high 50s market. So we're kind of bumping around. That high 50s is essentially capacity for us. And the result you see here in this next slide, this is the average daily rate. And you can see, I'm going to go back for a second, see how we're bumping along there, high 50s, nothing's happening in occupancy, no growth in occupancy. Well, the operators see that. Demand is still growing, and so the operators are able to drive average rate, and that's what they're doing right here. And you can see you've got a couple of years of 6% plus average rate growth. What's interesting is that in 2015, the growth decelerated, I guess is the word, right? We were going 6%, and now, you know, it's like 2% or 3% for 2015. So anyway, that's just something that we're keeping our eye on for Maine. Looking at RevPAR again, you can see that you know, strong, steady growth since 2009, and then slowing a little bit, as I mentioned, in 2015. Before I get into the markets, I'm going to talk about a couple of different markets here in Maine, and I wanted to point out there's an expression in the hotel industry, and I want to say this before I talked about any markets, because I wouldn't want to say this about any specific market, but there's an expression in the hotel industry that we are not oversupplied, we're under-demolished. And there are some markets in Maine that one could argue are under-demolished. And so it's something to bear in mind when we look at some of these numbers, because what happens, and by that I mean you've got some tired old product, and then a new hotel comes in, and it does great, right? You look at a market, and the market occupancy isn't that good, and then somebody builds a new hotel, and it does quite well, and it does well because of the quality of the product. It's not just stealing, it's also just creating demand. Suddenly people are staying there. I'm reminded of the president of Bates once told me, about 2 presidents ago, once told me about how excited his trustees were when the Motel 6 opened, because they were so excited to have a new hotel to stay at that they were all excited and looking forward to having a new Motel 6. Now, of course, I do a lot of work with colleges, and there's an arms race of colleges building new hotels for their trustees, boutique hotels and whatnot. Anyway, Augusta, trailing 12 months, 62%. Notice it's 62% above that high 50s that we talked about. This is for a select set of hotels in Augusta, primarily branded hotels, and they benefit from corporate demand. Right? So from a leisure, if you're leisure driven, you're going to be in that high 50s, and it's going to be hard to break out of that. When you throw in a corporate element that's going to get people to come midweek and come in the off-season months, you're going to get into those low 60s. Average rates just around $100, and you can see that occupancy is down slightly for trailing 12 and 15. Occupancy and average daily rate resulting in RevPAR being down. There's some talk that that's due to the prior year really benefited from a bunch of different project work that was going on in the area. There's a Homewood Suites going on under construction that a lot of you have probably seen on 295 on the left as you're heading north. There was talk of a proposed courtyard. It's my understanding that is no longer going forward at this point, but it shows that there continues to be interest in new development in Augusta. And right now, I'm not aware of any major changes to demand that are going to have a significant impact on market performance for 2016. Bath Brunswick, here you can see 61% up. The big thing in Bath Brunswick is how, the fact that they were up 2.2% in occupancy and up 3.3% in average rate for RevPAR growth of 5.6%. They had a really good year. One of the reasons they had a really good year was that the Holiday Inn was closed. They closed the Holiday Inn in Bath and are replacing it with a Residence Inn. BIW demand has reportedly been fairly steady, and Naval Air Station redevelopment continues to offer hope for the future for that lodging market as a source of growth and demand. Looking at Bangor, this is another one. This is really interesting to me. Occupancy 65%, pretty good occupancy, pretty good average daily rate relative to some of the other markets that we were just looking at. But look at that 8.2% decline in RevPAR. And I like this. So the answer is it's the loony. I was very excited to be able to put that in. Just to liven things up a little bit, it's the exchange rate. Is really hurting that market particularly. You're seeing less leisure transient travel and less group travel in particular. So it really having an impact there. There also has been some new supply in that market. The casino has stabilized. They took a little bit of a whack when Oxford opened, but that apparently has stabilized. And one interesting point in terms of a demand driver is the riverfront pavilion as a demand driver. By bringing those big acts in, it brings a lot of people from out of town and really helps. So that helps the local lodging market. Okay, Portland. Now we get to talk about Portland. Everybody's favorite subject these days. It remains everyone's favorite subject these days from a Maine perspective. You can see here it's 70% occupancy. This is just the downtown. So these are the hotels that are on the peninsula. So 70% occupancy at an average daily rate of $190. So 3.6% increase in occupancy, no impact to ADR, to average daily rate over the last year, even with the increase in new product. So it's great news. The operators, all the operators I talked to, everybody's happy because they have not had a rate war yet, and hopefully won't have a rate war. The rate has been helped by the fact that the new product that opened has is a higher end product and therefore gets a higher average daily rate, and that helps. But what's interesting to me is the fact that occupancy has even grown. So there's a tremendous amount of demand, and that's driven by what a great destination this is for leisure travelers, and then also for new companies and people moving to the area. So the TripAdvisor top 10 destination on the rise, certainly bodes well. The Press Hotel opened and was absorbed. Really little impact. There still remains a lot of interest in Portland. I still get a lot of phone calls about people looking for sites and interested in development here. There is an AC proposed that David Leatherwood's talking about doing down near the Residence Inn. Demand is still primarily leisure driven though, and that's really been the big driver. And as I mentioned, no rate wars yet. I wanted to look at South Portland this time as a point of comparison because one concern was that the new supply on the peninsula would result in a negative impact on the suburban Portland market. And we really haven't seen that. I mean, occupancy is at 66%, it's down 0.2%. Now, one thing that's important to note, these are the limited and select service hotels. It'd be a different story if we threw in the Marriott, Embassy, and the DoubleTree. The Westin, no doubt, is having an impact on at least one of those hotels that I'm aware of, and could possibly be having an impact on all three of them. But the limited and select service hotels are really holding up well, both in terms of occupancy and average daily rate. And the consensus is that it's really become a separate market. It used to be one big market, and now it's clearly two markets, and you can see that in the average daily rate of $110. Which is $80 lower than the peninsula, and oftentimes is 100 or even more lower during peak demand periods in the summer months. A couple notes on new supply. There's a Hampton Inn and Suites proposed for Exit 8. I still consider it Exit 8. I don't know what it is now. What is it? 48. Exit 48. There's a Hampton Inn and Suites proposed, and a Hilton Home 2 proposed for near the mall as well. So it'll be interesting to see if those go forward. Those would replace existing hotels that are tired and tired. Just a couple things to wrap up with. I want to talk about the Cliff House. The Cliff House is interesting. It's getting a lot of attention, and will get more attention. You'll see it more in the press as they roll out their PR and marketing campaign, because they are taking it up to a 4-diamond. There's a huge investment in the property, as you know, a group led by Mark Dugas. Purchased it. What's particularly interesting there, though, from a real estate investment perspective, is they teamed up with a private equity fund out of Ohio, which is also the fund that owns the Westin. And what's interesting about that is it's one of the first major forays of money, outside money, into the state in terms of institutional investment money coming into the state. And so it's getting some attention from that perspective. And I think that it bodes really well for the future for Maine, from the Maine investment community. It's going to attract more attention. And it's hopefully it's successful, and a successful investment, and will attract more money, more institutional grade investment money into the state. Right now, the national market, when you bring up Maine, they kind of say, no thanks. You know, we're a little too worried about access and seasonality and that sort of thing. So anyway, the Cliff House, 4-diamond, phase 2 opens in the spring of 2017 with another 110 rooms. Growth in 2015 is going to be hard to beat in 2016. I would not be surprised if we see that deceleration that I've mentioned earlier. A couple notes on new supply. Everyone's always interested in new supply. There is a 73-room Hampton Inn proposed for right at the exit in Kennebunk, as I understand it. 83-room Hampton Inn and Suites down in Kittery, and the Oxford Casino, the 90-room Hampton, I believe, is already open. So that was really all I had. Did anybody want to ask any questions of the Magic 8 Ball? All right, let's see. Will the Pats win on Sunday? Most definitely. There you go. You have it.